going to try this again. I'm going to stay calm because every time I get upset, every tech that I've used has gone haywire. So I'm going to stay calm and I'm going to get through this. And we're not going to have any kind of further difficulties. I am the U.S. guerrilla soldier of the PSYOPs war and the spiritual war because my master's degree gives me a very unique insight and skill set that allows me to be able to do this. And my past experiences, as I've shared with you on other podcasts, have given me unique insight into the fraud world. And my CSC paralegal that I'll have in May gives me the legal resources and tools and education to be able to do this as well. Today we're going to talk about investor fraud, corporate fraud, politician fraud, and we're going to use Federalist 35 to talk about it because that letter specifically addresses these things, particularly with monopolies and systems. Okay, like I said, I'm going to stay calm and hopefully the technical stuff of this works. Before we proceed to examine any other objections to an indefinite power of taxation in the Union, I shall make one general remark, which is that if the jurisdiction of the national government in the article of revenue should be restricted to particular objects, it would naturally occasion an undue proportion of the public burden to fall upon these objects. Two evils would spring from this source: the oppression of particular branches of industry and an unequal distribution of the taxes, as well among the several states as among the citizens of the same states. So we have two situations that could happen. We have not only monopolization, the unfair distribution of the industry, but also the unfair distribution of the tax burden upon the people inside those states and people not even part of those states, which houses those businesses or those factories or corporations. Suppose, as has been contended for, the federal power of taxation would be to confine to duties on imports. It is evident that the government, for want of being able to command other resources, would frequently be tempted to extend these duties to an injurious excess. So in order to cut taxes on the people, they might extend the duties of imports, and that creates an unfair burden on the merchants. There are persons who imagine that this can never be carried to too great a length, since the higher they are, the more it is alleged they will tend to discourage an extravagant consumption, to produce a favorable balance of trade, and to promote domestic manufactures. But all extremes are pernicious in various ways. So overtaxing on the duties is bad, but undertaxing on the duties is just as bad. Extremes on both ends is bad for the people inside that country. Exorbitant duties on imported articles would beget a general spirit of smuggling, which is always prejudicial to the fair trader, and eventually to the revenue itself. They tend to render other classes of the community tributary in an improper degree to the manufacturing classes, to whom they give a premature monopoly of the markets, and they sometimes force industry out of its more natural channels into others in which it flows with less advantage. So how does monopolies work? If you have a large-scale corporation and they're able to cut their prices because they can absorb that loss of profit because they're so big and they have such a huge consumer base, they will force the smaller business owners and startups to match that low price. And for those startup businesses and the small businesses who do not have that big population base, that consumer base, because they're so new, they can't compete. And in the last place, they oppress the merchant, who is often obliged to pay them himself without any retribution from the consumer. So in order to match that low pricing that the big guys have set, because they've devalued their pricing, now we have a situation that they have to cut into their own capital that they needed to keep that company going. Or what usually ends up happening is if they have workers, they have to lay off the workers, or they have to cut benefits, or they have to cut hours, or they have to start taking shortcuts, which are dangerous for those workers. When the demand is equal to the quantity of goods at market, the consumer generally pays the duty. But when the markets happen to be overstocked, a great proportion falls upon the merchant and sometimes not only exhausts his profits, but breaks in upon his capital. And it's not just manufacturing. We can look at the professional industries. Apparel textiles is a really good example. It used to be the first manufacturing industry in the United States. But people who are in that field, professionals who are actually in that field, apparel engineers and tailors, let's say the tailors in New York, have to compete now with hobbyists who will do it for free. This kind of trend of overstocking of a professional field can happen to plumbers, can happen to the trade industries that the politicians are trying to push now, saying there's a lack of skilled labor in the United States. There is not a lack of skilled labor. There's a lack of people willing to pay that skilled labor the price it's necessary in order to get the job done. I am apt to think that a division of the duty between the seller and the buyer more often happens than is commonly imagined, and it is not always possible to raise the price of a commodity in exact proportion to every additional imposition laid upon it. The merchant, especially in a country of small commercial capital, is often under a necessity of keeping prices down in order to get that sale, which is what we see. People want less is more. They want free shipping, they want free packaging, they want fancy, they want less, cheap, and good. What is it? Fast, cheap, and good? They want all three. And it used to be that you couldn't get all three, but that's the demand. And that is what the big markets, the e-commerce distributors and the e-commerce creators are able to do. The large-scale corporations are able to do. Healthcare, oil, energy, all of these corporations, education. And it forces everybody else in these professional, specialized fields to compete. And if they can't compete at that low pricing, then they end up getting shut out of the entire industry. The same thing can happen to lawyers because we now have the legal industry of online law firms that provide all the services that a startup company needs in order to create that company. So lawyers are just as much as a risk that everybody else is. The maxim that the consumer is the payer is so much oftener true than the reverse of the proposition that it is far more equitable that duties on imports should go into a common stock than that they should redound to an exclusive benefit of the importing states. It is not so generally true as to render it equitable that those duties should form the only national fund. When they are paid by the merchant, they operate as an additional tax upon the importing state. So when corporations pay taxes, those taxes go into the state and it becomes part of the revenue of that state and allows the people in that state to be able to have access to the things that they need and reduces their own financial burdens so that they can buy what they want from that corporation. It's a Henry Ford philosophy of the 1940s that whenever you pay your workers an affordable wage, they end up becoming the buyers of that company and a company will never go out of business. In this view, they are productive of inequality among the states, which inequality would be increased with the increased extent of the duties. So what we're looking at now, so in that view of increasing or decreasing, increasing these taxes and putting the burdens on the merchants, where they want to get no more taxes put on them because they're paying these high imports, and you give them release from the duties, you give them release from the taxes, so they're not paying anything now. See, that's what's happening right now. They're not paying duties and they're not paying taxes. Here they're talking about where they would be paying high duties, and so they would try to get out of paying taxes. But if they're not paying taxes, and now they're not paying high duties, now they're not contributing at all to the states. And if they're getting bailouts from the states and bailouts from the federal government, then basically we're taking our U.S. Treasury and we're pouring it into corporations, and they're not giving us anything back. If you recall, well, let me finish this point. I'll get to that point next. The merchant, especially in a country of small commercial capital, is often under the necessity of keeping. Let's see. I think I got screwed up. So this is what happens when I try to go to a new point. Hold on. but it is not so generally true as to render it equitable when those duties should form the only national fund, and when they are paid by the merchant, they operate as an additional tax upon the importing state, whose citizens pay their proportion of them in the character of consumers. And in this view, they are productive of inequality among the states, which inequality would be increased with the increased extent of the duties, and a confinement of the national revenues, this is talking about U.S. Treasury, to this species of impost would be attended with inequality from a different cause between the manufacturing and the non-manufacturing states. The states which can go furthest towards the supply of their own wants, so the ones that can actually supply the things that they need because they have the resources inside that state, by their own manufacturers will not, according to their numbers of wealth, consume so great a proportion of imported articles as those states which are not in the same favorable solution or situation, and they would not therefore in this mode alone contribute to the public treasury in a ratio to their abilities. One of the things that the U.S. Constitution did was create a trade agreement between all the states so that we didn't have this unfair proportion of taxes and saying, well, this state is only going to have to cover this and this state's only going to have to cover this. The U.S. Constitution created federal guidelines that made all states accountable to the same law so that there would be no unequal distribution or coverage or expectation on any states. It is a trade agreement. So let's look at what's happening right now, because it's not even the people that own the factories, it's the investors who have invested in the factories. This is where back in 1960s, when the financial engineers kicked out the real engineers in manufacturing and turned manufacturing into a financial institution, where it now becomes not about the workers or the community where the manufacturing factory is housed, but it's all about shareholder value. When we have these layoffs, when we have these restructuring, when factories are moved out of one country and into another, it's not about the people, it's about the shareholder value. So how does that work? We have investment firms that can come in and they promise these promises of salvation to struggling factories or companies. And they say, if you give me controlling interest, I will take care of you, but you have to give me controlling interest of your company. Well, because the company is already struggling, once they get that controlling interest, they will go ahead and let it bankrupt. And as it's bankrupting, they will liquidate all the inventory and all the assets, and because they have controlling interest, it goes right into that investment firm pocket. And then, because the company is struggling, they will go to the politicians and beg them for money, getting bailouts from the U.S. Treasury and from the state treasury, and that goes into the investor's pocket. And once everything is completely sucked out, this is why they're called vulture capitalists. Everything is sucked out of that company. They will sell it off and suck out the remaining equity and put it into their pocket. And usually what happens is they screw over the owners of the company with B-shell holding accounts, so they get away with doing all of this without putting really any capital up. Sometimes it can just be, just no capital at all if the factory is engaged in, shady employer practices. And of course, they're not going to go to the FBI or anything, and the vulture capitalists, they know this. So we have these situations where we have this happening. And when we look at federal governments, foreign governments that have state-owned enterprises and government-controlled corporations, we now have a situation where we can have a foreign government gain controlling interest of an entire country's industries, all the industries. And if politicians are pushing all the wealth and power into the corporations that belongs to the American people under the under the 10th Amendment, sorry, my daughter just came in and distracted me, under 10th Amendment, which gives the people power of our government. Anything not given to federal government, not given to state government, is given to the American people, the individuals. And if we have politicians who come in and they push this Russian Ayn Rand fictional novel of limited government and free market control, they have taken the power away from the people and have created a corporation and have given a legal identity as a person and therefore given them power as an American person that belongs to the American people. So if you have a foreign government who has SOE, state-owned enterprises, or federal-controlled corporations, and they acquire the corporations that have been given power of the American people, that foreign government can steal all the power that belonged to the American people, and now that foreign government is making rules, and they're bribing the politicians, and they're changing the laws, and before you know it, that country is no longer under its own people. Because if you remember, America is a nation of, for, and by the people. Congress works for the people. We elected people into power. We can fire every person we elect. That is our job, our duty, our responsibility, because America is unique. It is a nation of, for, and by the people. We have no rulers. And if you recall, in 1773, the Boston Tea Party, when small merchants and artists threw tea into that Boston harbor, it was a protest of a foreign government gouging American taxpayers in order to make up for the 7-Year War. England and Spain were fighting over the territories of U.S., and they had lost a lot of money because war is expensive, and they were using taxes upon the American buyers to try to profit and take that taxes and put into their royal vaults. That's why we went to war with the Revolutionary War. That's why we gained our independence. So the question is, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing vulture capitalists to come in and seize control of our federal government and give away our entire industry to foreign governments who have state-owned enterprises, when that is the reason the United States of America gained its independence in the first place? Are we going to let a bunch of sniveling vulture capitalists who are too stupid to hide their money trails because they use emotional distraction, and because for some reason they have decided that a vulture capitalist is going to control the federal agencies and the agents can't even do their job? Are we going to allow that? Or are the state governments going to get up off their ass and get involved? Because that is what the Second Amendment is all about. When there is federal usurpation, the state governments get involved. 50 states, come on people, 50. You're telling me that 50 states, every single one of them is corrupt, that New York is the only one that does not have a corrupt AG? Are you kidding me right now? 50 states. Surely a handful, 5, 10, where you at? Where you at? Second Amendment is not about guns. It's about state power. And until we start pushing that state power, hey, county governments, if your state leaders is not representing you, your district, then you get rid of them. You can impeach them. Use your county governments, state governments. If your federal leaders are not representing you as the way you need to be, get rid of them. You can impeach them. Article 2, Section 4, any civil officer under the United States can be impeached, and you use the government that's below them to do it. That's how it works. So when we know our laws, we know the structure of our laws, we don't need to have those vulture capitalists stealing everything from us. And we don't have American people and American lives being exchanged for corporate shareholder value. Because let me tell you, United States of America, 99% is far greater than 1%, and we have 50 states to one federal government.